Well, not surprisingly, I guess, so many things that used to be precious or limited are commonplace. And matches used to be one of those things. And of course, smoking tobacco and other things was much more popular than it has been in the last 20 years or so. But it turned out that through the late 1800s and the early 1900s, matches were a precious enough commodity that they were carried in their own little boxes, and so many of these match safes were made by a number of companies and jewelers. The higher end ones are made out of sterling silver, but I think many of them, from what I've read, were brass or plated materials. And they run the range from very simple, plain, to just a little bit of engraving, to extremely complex and ornate. The one I've made is mid-range toward the ornate side. It turns out that there's quite a market for these. The originals can sell upwards of many thousands of dollars, but it turned out that about the 1970s, as many things happen, a whole bunch of reproductions came on the market, and so collectors have to be quite careful about what they're buying. And typically these reproductions or common vintage ones will be in the several $100s range rather than the several to many thousands of dollars range. So one of the issues that I take seriously is when I produce items that are basically very similar, and some of them are indistinguishable in their final form from a vintage piece. My intent is not to counterfeit, right? I mean, I am making a new piece, and I'm trying to emulate and reanimate the old arts. And so I go ahead and I make sure that I add my signature or other identifying markings to every piece that I make like that, partly as an artistic piece, partly to take responsibility for the quality of the metals and the quality of the assembly, and partly so that it can be readily identified as being a modern new piece made by me, rather than trying to pretend that it is an actual antique or vintage piece from 100 or 200 years ago. Well, I am not unhappy. It was one heck of a fun learning experience. The lid almost is perfect, but it isn't quite. I have a fraction of a millimeter off on the hinge, so the lid isn't 100%. But yeah, it looks pretty good. I oxidized it. Didn't buff it too terribly. I had to carved the striker area because that is in the die in the original design. But I obliterated that texture when I assembled it. Yeah, so interesting match safe with this. So what I did, I used a stainless steel piece of welding wire. So it's TIG welding filler wire for the pin, for that spring, and yeah, that seems to be pretty good. Very fun. So this particular design is made available by Kevin Potter and his company. It's a robust die. It's quite deep, and it's on a fairly large piece of steel. And pressing it is not for the faint of heart. It took me about 3 hours total to get a couple of good pressings. What you need to do, of course, is, as all things with this, you start by using just a very small piece of urethane or some kind of pusher in the middle of the design to sink the metal into the volume. You need to not trap metal around the edges. That's what will lead to tearing in this design. But once you have gotten it more or less pushed flat and it looks like a little rectangular impression, then comes the fun part, and you have to start just repressing it multiple times in order to capture the bulk of the design. Now, one of the things I did that several other people, including the Potter crew, have made videos on to facilitate getting an impression is to make a variety of forces. A force is similar to a positive of the negative die. And you make this out of a relatively soft material. I used aluminum for most of these. And I made several different kinds of them, including from aluminum foil and from solid chunks of aluminum. And by using these in sequence, and sometimes meaning you press just a piece of the design, and then you make a different force to go on and press another portion of the design. And by repeating that over and over with annealing between every single step, eventually I was able to produce two reasonably detailed halves, and it was those halves then that I was going to assemble into a final volume of a match safe. After I was happy with the pressings, what I did was use a file and just traditional methods, and I trimmed it after sawing it, got it reasonably well framed, and then I left a little lip of metal at the bottom of each of the halves just to facilitate alignment. Then what I did was place them together, use some titanium spring clamps, and I began at the bottom after fluxing generously the entire piece. And I began applying small balls of solder with a pick to the heated pieces. And by doing that, and starting at the bottom and working my way up the sides, in sequence, I could use hard solder for the entire operation. And once I got it about 2/3 done, I had to stop, and I had to use my saw and begin to cut the top away from the bottom. But I didn't want to complete that. The reason I was doing it at this stage was to provide venting for the piece, because I didn't want to have it explode, because it's quite a volume in there, and you have to get it reasonably hot in order to solder these two halves together. After I was comfortable with the two halves soldered together, I then used my Magic Potter jeweler's saw and a number 5 blade, and I was able to cut the top away from the bottom. Now, you could do this in multiple stages, but I found that I needed to have these aligned, and what I did was to do this and make a really straight cut. It's handy to make those two initial cuts, one on each end, and then you angle your saw blade up, and you just cut like the length of the entire line on one side. Go about halfway down and then turn it over and do the other side, and that will help align the two sides so that when you cut through it, it looks like you did it with a razor blade almost. It can be really quite nice and very impressive. Then what you may need to do, because you've clamped the metal and heated it, you may need to take the equivalent of a screwdriver or something and gently pry open the box, because it may have compressed in the middle, and so I had to do that just a little bit to open the volume of the box. Well, my next step was to make the inner collar. This is going to help position the lid and keep it stable. I didn't want a collar that surrounded the entire thing. I thought about it, but I really wanted to add a hinge. And so I made a collar out of a piece of sterling silver that I rolled out to be about 26 gauge. And then I made my mark and my quality stamp on both sides of it. Formed it, framed it, and then clamped it in place and used, again, hard solder in order to position it and get it into where I needed it to be. What I decided to do next was to add the holder for the piece of stainless steel wire that was going to serve as the spring. Now, there's a variety of different ways you can attach these springs. You can make them out of brass or other materials. But one really handy thing to do is what I did was I used a piece of brass tube, and I had a piece of brass tubing that would allow me to force fit a piece of steel wire into it. So much like putting a pipe in the ground so that you can support a bird feeder on a pole, for example, I added solder, hard solder, to a small piece of brass tubing about 15 millimeters long, and I then soldered it into the bottom of the box. Then I turned my attention to the top, and one of the things that you need to do with the top before you do much else is add a piece of very robust silver bar or something like that to the side that you're going to want to have the hinge on, and that's going to be like a striker piece. It's going to be a piece that's going to rub up against the spring and exert pressure so that the spring is intended to keep the lid closed when it's closed. That way you don't have to have any kind of catch or latch on the front end of this thing. It's more invisible than that. So to do that, I just formed a piece of robust sterling silver wire out of this sheet, and I hard soldered it to the inside of the lid. Now, use a piece of metal that's going to be, substantially, maybe even twice as long as what you think you're going to need, because you're going to be cutting it and filing it to fit once you install the hinge and the spring. The next step for me was to fashion the hinge, mostly just the hinge knuckles. And you just have to be aware that there are 40 or 50 different ways, I think, to make hinges, and I actually do them differently in different cases. But for this one, I used a technique that's very comparable to what I do for lockets. And so if you need more detail, feel free to check out my other videos on making lockets. Bottom line is I simply align the top and the bottom, and then I use a round file and cut a little bit of a depression in the side so I can position a piece of tubing. Then I solder a piece of heavy tubing to the back part of the bulk of the box. Now, in order to prevent the solder from flowing onto the top of the box at this point, I cover the top joint with a solder blocking material that I like. After that, then, of course, I will trim the bottom piece, and I will cut the middle out of it and leave the two sides and trim them up nice and straight. Those make the two side knuckles. Then I put a slightly wider piece on the top and position the knuckles in alignment with a wire in between. And this time I put the solder block on the lower part and run some hard solder to attach the middle knuckle to the top or the lid of the box. This usually works pretty darn well. One of the final stages in your fabrication is going to be now to finalize your spring. And like I said, I used a piece of, I think it's 3/32 stainless steel filler wire from TIG welding. And you could use a variety of different materials. This picture here is of the final profile. Because this box does not have a straight side, I found it necessary to put a recurved or almost S shape into this steel wire. I then also tapered the end that I was shoving into that brass knuckle that I had soldered previously down at the bottom. And this shape plus that taper allowed me to just use a pair of pliers and very forcefully friction fit this, press this in. And then I simply fiddled with both the length of that steel post and the length of the silver striking piece on the lid until I optimized them. If you examine the mechanism a little bit, I think you can very clearly see that there's going to be an optimum length for both of those that will allow the lid to stay firmly closed when it's finally shut. Then in order to pin the hinge, I just used a piece of tubing, again, pretty heavy wall sterling tubing, and I used it as the pin, and that let me use a very small dapping punch on either side to flare the tubing. So it's kind of like a double-sided tube rivet in that case, I guess. And that's all there is to it. Then I applied an oxidation, waxed it, buffed it, and I think I made a pretty serviceable match safe. Anyway, the construction is interesting. It was a great deal of fun, and I hope that you would try it yourself.